Thank you all for coming out to our presentation or book launch tonight for the latest volume in the multi-volume history of Ukraine-Rus by Mykhailo Hrushevsky. My name is Yaros Milan. I'm the acting director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I'm pleased to greet you all on this auspicious occasion, the appearance of another volume in the histories. First of all, I would just like to take the opportunity to acknowledge a few people who are in the audience today. We have Gordon Gorday, who's with the Ukrainian-Polish Foundation for College Education, the president, and I believe also on the Shevchenko Foundation, which has been a very, very big pillar of support for this publishing project. Dr. Jeanette Paiduzia is here. She's a sponsor of one of the volumes and a donor to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. David Marples is the chair of history at the University of Alberta, is here. And I just wanted to single out Andrea Colette, who has just joined the university's Office of Advancements. So I looked around the room and I thought, well, I should mention them, and I said, no, you got to stop somewhere. So I'm going to stop there. But we're also hoping that Mr. Janusz Tomczak from the Canadian-Polish Congress Alberta branch might be joining us as well. Before I say a few introductory remarks, I want to just also take the opportunity to make a couple of announcements, which I may remind you of at the end of the evening. First thing is that in this room on Friday at 6:30 p.m. there's going to be a screening of a film called Chapters and Verses, Action Bill's Walk Through Life. This is a documentary film made by the daughter of Vasily or Bill Kureliu. Kureliu family name is well known in our university. They also were major donors to the cool Ukrainian Folklore Center. And it's a documentary about a remarkable man who immigrated in 1928 from the village of Potoczyce in Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast in western Ukraine. And he's a real character. And I haven't seen the film yet, but Dr. Sisson, who has, says it's actually very well made and a very sort of slice of life of what that interwar generation of Ukrainians was like. So 6:30 p.m. here, and it's sponsored jointly by the Cool Folklore Center, the Cool Ukrainian Canadian Studies Center at Kyiv, and the Shevchenko Foundation, and who else? Lenny, help me. I think I got just about everybody. So you're all invited to that. And last but not least, on Monday, 30 October, so the day before Halloween, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is sponsoring a reading and an appearance by the Ukrainian poet, writer, and essayist Andriy Yubka. It will be in this room, 7 o'clock p.m., and it will be in Ukrainian. And for those of you who follow contemporary Ukrainian literature, you'll know that Andriy is kind of a hot young writer with a growing following in Ukraine. So it's a chance for us to get to know him better and to spend some time with him. So I hope you can all make it to that. Turning now to, and I see that, there he is, okay. Andriy, we just started 2 seconds ago, and I just wanted to welcome especially as well Andriy Vladishevsky, who is the president of the Shevchenko Foundation, and he will be giving his remarks as well this evening. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Frank Sisson, I just want to say a few words about the Hrushevsky translation project as somebody who's watched it evolve and develop over the years. History in Ukraine, I just returned from Ukraine, and one of the things that really strikes you, of course, if you follow what's going on in Ukraine, is the very, very important role that history is playing in all kinds of discussions. That there is a new, modern, civic Ukrainian identity that is being formed, that is uniting the country in a way that has eluded it for some time, the different regions and everything. And of course, both historical memory, but also actual history, factual history, is playing a very, very important role in this. At the same time, history is a battleground. There is a war going on in Ukraine, and part of that war involves an information war, and it involves scholars who debate different aspects of the history. And of course, Mykhailo Hrushevsky has a very special place in Ukrainian history, not only as the president of an independent Ukraine that was short-lived, but as a scholar who was the first one to write a comprehensive history of the Ukrainian lands and the Ukrainian people, and told from a Ukrainian point of view, because of course histories were written that included Ukrainian history, mostly by neighboring powers, powers that controlled parts of Ukraine, and they were written with a very specific, partly with a specific purpose in mind, and that was to reinforce territorial, political, cultural claims to the people and the territory of Ukraine. So Hrushevsky really is the man who broke ground for the writing of Ukrainian history, and his works are important precisely for that reason. Now, of course, when he was writing his history, it was just over 100 years ago, and he mobilized students to help with this project, doing research, pulling together sources from all these different languages and weaving it together into this synthetic history of Ukraine. This project is designed to bring that work into the wider world. We all know that English is the international language of scholarship, as well as business and a few other things, and that's why this translation project is important. But this isn't just a translation project. This is also an important work of scholarship, and a whole team of scholars have been working on this because it's involved going back to the original sources cited by Hrushevsky, checking them for their accuracy, because sometimes mistakes were made in translating things into Ukrainian. The standards of scholarship 100 years ago weren't what they are now, so identifying in a scholarly way the actual source of the material, correcting things, but also updating, because so much work has been done on Ukrainian history and archaeology since the volumes appeared, that in the annotations that material was brought into the translations. I'm very pleased that the person who has been overseeing this project for the Clean Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Dr. Frank Sisson, who is the director of the Peter Jacek Center for Ukrainian History at CIUS, is here with us tonight, and he's going to share his perspective on this particular volume, the fourth volume. It's actually the 10th volume that has appeared so far, and there's 2 more to go. But this volume covers the 14th to the 16th century, a very turbulent time in the history of Ukraine, but also a very interesting time. So I'll now turn the microphone over to Dr. Sisson.
Thank you. First, the issue of PowerPoint always comes up. So what I want you to do is remember the beautiful volumes you saw as you came into this room. All of those lovely covers, you can go examine them later. They're a study of itself of artifacts of the Ukrainian cultural past. And imagine it's up on that screen as I'm talking, okay? And then I think we will do better on it. Now, I'm very pleased to be here this evening at the St. John's Institute. But for me, the St. John's Institute is the shell, but the heart of the institute is the Mykhailo Hrushevsky Institute. That is the original institute that was formed in 1918 in Edmonton, choosing the name of Mykhailo Hrushevsky, and formed by Ukrainian students here in Edmonton at that time. And I think when we think of the distances from Kyiv to Edmonton, and the fact that the people who formed that institute, many of them had come to Canada as Galicians, Bukovinians, Ruthenians, Lemkos, using various names for themselves, but were in Canada taking on the new name Ukrainian. It shows that the importance of Hrushevsky's work and why they chose Hrushevsky, I think, at that time. I admit I have not done the research. I think we have to go back and look and see if we have memoirs and find out who actually proposed this, how much material there are, the original booklets from the Institute. I think it would tell us much. But I think we understand the reasons for it. 1918 was the year of the proclamation of independent Ukrainian statehood, with Hrushevsky the leader of that state at the beginning of the year. The reaction was tremendous in 1917, the 100th anniversary we're going through this year, and 1918 among Ukrainian communities abroad to those changes in Ukraine. The whole process of nation forming that was going on in Ukraine, in a certain way, was going on in tandem in Canada, in the US, in Brazil, where all Ukrainian communities existed. And so therefore it would seem right at that time that those groups of students would choose the name of the head of that state. But the reason they knew much about him, and before that, was that Hrushevsky had become the leader of the Ukrainian national movement, not only in the so-called eastern or Dnieper Ukraine, but also in the western areas of Galician Ukraine, very clearly by the year 1900. That is, both the enemies of that movement and the proponents saw Hrushevsky as the head, but above all because he was a historian. And I think this is I think, extremely important for us to remember. We tend in Anglo-Saxon societies not to give as much precedence to historians as many of the Central and Eastern European societies and cultures do. We pay relatively little attention to the monuments, and we have a great decline, I think, in many ways of the teaching of history in many of our school systems. Eastern European and Central European historians have generally fared quite better. Czechs know about Palatsky and Masaryk. These are major figures in their development. And so it was true for the Ukrainian movement and the formation of modern Ukraine. But above all, because Hrushevsky had done something that a modern political scientist, John Armstrong, called a fundamental act of nation building for Ukrainians. That is, their history existed, or history exists in some other sense, but he gave them their history as well. That is, he codified their history with, above all, not just an account and not just a popular book, but an academic, modern history of Ukraine. And as we talk about a work that came out 100 years ago, it is sometimes difficult to remember its modernity at its time. And some of that modernity has made it to this day of importance for the study of Ukrainian, Central European, and Eastern European history. That is, Armstrong said that every national movement needs an academic history in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, as a way of giving a legitimization for a nation, and above all, for a nation which did not have a state. And here we always run into the problems of English terminology. So often in English, nation and state are seen as synonyms. In many cultures and societies, they are not. We just heard Jagiellonian talk about civic nation forming in Ukraine. That's part of the story, but you can only really have a fully civic nation once you have a state. And before that, there were ethnocultural and national groups who often formed civil society, as Hrushevsky was a great leader in doing, and who then brought about the conceptualization of the territory of the nation and ultimately its state. And he was important in all of those processes. Now, I have heard that the head of the Polish Congress is not yet with us. This makes my talk a little easier, because much of this talk is going to go back to a period of relative tension between Poles and Ukrainians. I think many of you think at the moment much more in terms of Russian-Ukrainian tensions at a time of war. And this, of course, is perhaps the major stream of the problem of Ukrainian development and state formation. But we must remember, although relations improved with Poles and in certain ways more recently have worsened, that this for the Ukrainian movement of the beginning of the 20th century was just as important a problem as the two stateless peoples had varying and often contending programs for the formation of a state. I'll begin this with a quote from the introduction to the new volume of Hrushevsky we'll be discussing today by Professor Robert Frost from Aberdeen. And he describes when Hrushevsky arrives in the city of Lviv. He comes from Kyiv to Lviv in the early 1890s. He is invited to take up a chair at Lviv University. And Frost writes, from the moment he arrived in Lviv, he implied his talents and his naturally skeptical eye to the massive Polish scholarship on the period. He had every respect for good Polish scholarship, of which there was a great deal. But he was merciless in exposing the shortcomings of scholars who fell short of his exacting standards. He was particularly scathing in his treatment of Polish historians who published on the history of the Grand Duchy and the Ukrainian lands on the basis largely or even exclusively of Polish scholarship, or whose command of Ukrainian or Russian was poor or even non-existent. His contempt for such scholars was revealed in a devastating review written in 1900. So we're getting into academic polemics, right? Hrushevsky writes a review on the edition of the second Lithuanian Statute of 1566 by Franciszek Piekoszyński, a distinguished Polish medievalist and a holder of the chair at the Jagiellonian University, the great University of Krakow. Hrushevsky began by lamenting the general state of Polish scholarship on the eastern lands of the former Commonwealth, that is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, pointing out the weight of the Polish historical tradition that lay like a stone on contemporary Poland, in which the history of Ukraine-Rus, Belarus, and Lithuania were treated as part of Polish history and not examined on their own terms. He excoriated the ignorance of Ukrainian scholarship shown by many Polish scholars, pointing out that some could not even read the West Ruthenian language, as they termed it. He took exception to the way in which Piekoszyński's edition was advertised by the Academy of Learning in Krakow as, in quotes, a monument of Polish law, in complete discard of the traditions of Lithuanian and Ruthenian law, that is the term usually used for earlier Ukrainian, that had formed it. He criticized Piekoszyński, a renowned scholar, as he termed him with more than a note of sarcasm, for publishing his edition in parallel Polish and Latin text, and for errorly claiming that no text of the statute had survived in the original language. Hrushevsky took pleasure in pointing out that on the last page of the sumptuous edition, prepared with all the resources of the Academy, Piekoszyński had been forced, while the book was at the printers, to add a paragraph, which Hrushevsky reproduced with relish in full in the original Polish, revealing a Polish colleague's report that a Ruthenian edition had been unearthed in the Romantsev Museum in Moscow. Discovered by the Poles, perhaps, but as Hrushevsky pointed out with sarcastic glee, this version had been published in Moscow as long ago as 1854. The Academy could have purchased the copy for the princely sum of 2 rubles. Now, this was a massive zinger in scholarly terms. And it shows that, of course, scholarship can be fun and also let out a lot of spleen. But for our purposes, to understand what's going on with Hrushevsky and these debates, why are they of importance, what did it mean for the two societies that are forming, in this case largely in Galicia, the areas under Austria-Hungary, and what Hrushevsky was doing when he was writing his history. That review appears as he is writing this volume. He's putting together the material. So why? What went on and why was Hrushevsky so important? First of all, he was so important because he came from Russian-ruled Ukraine, from the university in Kyiv, to the city of Lviv, an area with Ukrainian dominance in the areas around it, but with a Polish majority in the city of Lviv and part of the Habsburg territories. Now, why is that important? Because the conceptualization of Ukrainians and the conceptualization of Ukraine, and we've got to keep remembering, there was no Ukraine as an accepted administrative entity in either of these empires in 1900. The only way one could see Ukraine were the maps that were beginning to be published by the Ukrainian movement showing you a Ukraine on the map. That if this project, as we tend to call them, national project, was to succeed, it could only succeed if together the gray areas of the major part of Velika Ukraina, as it was called then, of Great Ukraine, could be combined with the areas of Western Ukraine where people had relatively more freedom to deal with both scholarship and the publication of literature in Ukrainian, above all in the Ukrainian language. And so when in 1890, in the constant conflict that was developing between, as they were largely called, Ruthenians and Poles of Galicia at this point, an attempt was made at compromise. One of the compromises was to form a history chair at the University of Lviv in which one could lecture in the Ukrainian language, and it would be assumed the chair would be on Ukrainian history. And it was assumed at this point that the holder of the chair would come from the city of Kyiv. It would be Professor Volodymyr Antonovich, who had organized this arrangement. And he would come, and this would raise the level of Ukrainians within the province of Galicia, which at the university had a number of chairs, Ukrainian chairs already, but not a major chair in history. And this was, in a way, a payoff to the more conservative elements of the Ukrainian movement in Galicia for coming to compromises on other issues with the dominant Polish establishment of the province. That is, this would be something they would get for their cooperation. In the end, Professor Antonovich decided not to come. And instead, he decided to send whom he viewed as his best student, I believe at the age of 28, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, to move to the Austrian Empire and to take up this position, tremendous advance for a historian and tremendous faith in him, and to carry out the project of building beyond the border of the Russian Empire a Ukrainian scholarship and society. And there were already institutions in Lviv where this would exist. There was the university, which has many dates of founding, depending whose side of arguments you want to be on. It's either 1617 or the 1790s, or it's restored in 1817. It depends whether you want to connect it to Polish Jesuits or Austrian Imperial Habsburg families, or in the first half of the 19th century, it was a German language university largely with Ruthenian courses at it. But after 1867, the university was Polonized, was turned into a Polish institution with just a few chairs that the Ruthenians or Ukrainians had. There was also the Shevchenko Scientific Society, which was not too scientific or scholarly in its initial formation. It was formed in the 1860s, largely by donors coming from Russian-ruled Ukraine, where you had a larger number of wealthy Ukrainians who could not really increase the Ukrainian movement because of the 1863 and 1876 bans on Ukrainian language, the inability to organize. They give funding for the formation of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, and Prosvita is the 1860s, Shevchenko is the 1870s, and are able to, through this society, in the time of the 1890s, to convert it into a de facto Academy of Sciences. And Hrushevsky carries out that action to a great degree. So it's a civic organization, somewhat funded by the civil authorities, because Ukrainians did get a piece of the pie in Galicia. They got the small piece from the Polish establishment, but they did get it. And then Hrushevsky was very important in Lviv because he, like Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky in the Greek Catholic Church, was a man of means. And this turned out to be very important in a province where Ruthenians or Ukrainians were relatively disadvantaged, where the number of very wealthy people was few, that Sheptytsky could form a national museum, already called a national museum, in the city of Lviv before the First World War, showed the importance of having means. But in the case of Hrushevsky, it's a wonderful story how he got his money. His father wrote a Church Slavonic textbook that sold throughout the Russian Empire. And so his father, as a scholar, became quite wealthy on his scholarship. Rare we would be able to do it today, and certainly through Church Slavonic. And this meant that Hrushevsky was able to depend on his own means in living, and this also meant, as he could share these means of supporting students, supporting projects, he was able to develop a new society in Galicia. Now, what did he come to? What I tried to outline is the great man who changes history, and in many ways Hrushevsky is the great man who changes history. Without him, his character, his tenacity, not always an easy man to deal with, but this tremendous energy, this man who produced not only these huge volumes, but hundreds and hundreds of articles, who edited newspapers, who was involved in politics, who was dealing with students at all this time. Tremendous to have one man of energy and genius who can change things. But you have to have an environment that works. And he hit Galicia at the right time. When you look at its social formation. I think the period from 1890 to 1914 in the Western Ukraine is an amazing period to study and to examine to what degree the formerly disadvantaged Ruthenians make rapid progress in difficult and challenging political and social situations. In many ways, it deals with the challenged concept of history. That is, they were challenged by a regime which worked against them in many ways, but did not destroy them or take away their ability to respond. And they were able to meet that challenge through civic organization, national organization, cultural organization, so much so that by the time the First World War comes, the question of who will really control the eastern Galician province part, the Western Ukraine as we would call it today, was greatly in question. Now they also had, in some ways, an advantage over the Polish elite of Galicia. The great problem of the Polish elite, or conservative elite of Galicia, was that it depended on the landowning aristocracy and earlier social formations to keep power for a long time. It had the disadvantage that in the eastern part of the provinces, Poles, or people who were going to think of themselves Poles, were the minority and going to lose if you changed the electoral reform law, the ways in which power was divvied up. And it made it very difficult, much greater number of social, cultural, and political forces among Poles. The Ruthenians, as they were called, were very largely, at that time, a rural peasant population with a relatively small elite, largely of the clergy and a forming lay intelligentsia. And they could side themselves on what might be called the progressive elements of change. That is, they were uniformly for having universal, I'm afraid, male suffrage, which is at the time what one would have. They were uniformly for social policies that would favor the poor in the rural areas, were largely their constituency. And in so doing, they in some way could consolidate their forces in a way that were very actively developed under the leadership, relatively radical leadership of Hrushevsky. And this was a period of the radicalization of the Ukrainian movement in Galicia, in which the challenges to the regime that Hrushevsky leads are important. Now, what kind of challenges there are? This was a relatively civilized world. Professors were still given and treated each other generally quite decently at meetings. Slamming a door, leaving a faculty meeting was viewed as an unpardonable sin in the view of 1900, right? So we're in a very different world. We who now live in the Trumpian universe can only dream of such a world. But when Hrushevsky arrives in Lviv, among the things he does is, first of all, he's given a chair in which he is to lecture in Ukrainian. But the university demands that at the Senate meetings, you had to speak Polish. You didn't have to know Polish to get the chair, which was an absurdity. And Hrushevsky begins to challenge the rules of the university, speaking Ukrainian at these faculty meetings. In 1901, the head of the faculty, Kazimierz Twardowski, demands that Hrushevsky be translated into speak Polish, or someone translate him. Hrushevsky leaves a faculty meeting and may or may not have slammed the door, which was much discussed then in Polish newspapers. But what he was doing was leading a movement that largely was demanding that the university either become what they called Utrquist, that is a Polish-Ukrainian university in which languages would be equal, I guess a bilingual university we would call them, or that the Ukrainians get their own university. And this movement attracted large numbers of students, and Hrushevsky becomes a leader of students in that city. He also is propagating the name Ukraine and Ukrainians in an area which largely had called themselves Ruthenians, as they traditionally had in Galicia, and beginning to switch names. And the new and progressive youth goes for this movement. He finds resonance outside of the circles of the university and the intelligentsia of Lviv, and through the widespread newspapers to much of the province. But I think in many ways, what is extremely important is Hrushevsky begins to change the scholarly balance. There was a well-developed Polish historical profession, deeply and excellent institutions that Poles had formed in the province, including in Lviv. Hrushevsky arrives rejecting, first of all, the idea that Ukrainians were to be a subordinate group. So the demands for the equal language of the university, all these demands demand full equality and the letter of the law, not the practice of the law. Those laws sometimes varied as to what they had rights to do. And basically argued that taxpayers' money was to be divided differently than it had been, that Ukrainians were to demand their full rights within this system. And that broke a lot of conventions in Ukrainian Galician society. We have a tendency to be very nostalgic about the Habsburg regime and sometimes even about Galicia. You know, Galicia was famous for its crooked elections, paying off of voters to vote your other way. There were a lot of problems in that old Galicia that they only looked good because of things that often happened later that were worse. But Hrushevsky is beginning to change that. But more important, he comes to say, we have our history, our scholarship, and it will equal that of the Poles. Now, it doesn't really in full terms initially, but he is tremendously effective in enlisting students and youth. There's a whole generation that comes very rapidly in this territory. People like Moshevsky, Krypiakevich, Korduba, the great Ukrainian historians, all of them formed within a very few years of Hrushevsky arriving in the city and in the decade. He also was stunning to the students of Lviv because Habsburg professors tended to be rather pompous fellows. You know, they were either Oxford or Harvard or whatever of the old school. And Hrushevsky was very democratic. He even had students calling himself Tavarish. You know, you can picture in Galicia of that time how stunning this would be that a student should address a professor, a pan professor, in such a way. So Hrushevsky is very effective in enlisting students, but above all, finding talented students. And so by 1905, 1906, there is already a tremendously vibrant group that is going to produce a large part of the Ukrainian historiography we have to this day. And it's all because he arrives there. And he changes the Zapiske Entesha, the journal, into a scholarly journal. He's putting Ukrainians on the map in the scholarly world. Now, he also is writing the history. he's beginning in 1890s, early 90s, to writing those volumes, and he's going to write 3 volumes on the period of Old Rus, he would have called it. He largely did not call it Kiev and the Rus, and later sometimes he used it. And then he's going to write 3 volumes on the period of which Lithuania and Poland ruled the Ukrainian territories. And then he hits what for him was the important Cossack age. And here he just sort of loses control. That is, he planned 3 volumes, but the 3 volumes were not going to work. So it's volume 7 and 8 and 9 in its various parts and 10, and then he doesn't finish. So tremendous amount of source material. Now, what's most important? First of all, Hrushevsky believed still in a generation that historians who believed that they could, that there was truth, that there was historical truth one could find. So we have to live in their world. They didn't relativize this. They believed that through the careful examination of sources and looking at all the sources you had and weighing the material, you could believe that. I just was looking at the new CNN ads about, this is an apple, they tell you it's a banana, but don't believe them, it's not a banana, it's really an apple. So he was going to tell them that this was an apple, right, doing it. Now, what was most important for what we now have of value today is within this, Hrushevsky believed you had to gather as many sources as possible, and you had to show what you had used them and what you had done with them, and that you had examined them, and that you looked with countervailing opinions, and you looked at all the other scholars in the field before you then gave your judgment on them. And that's given his work an importance, particularly in the volumes where he dealt with sources that are lost to us now, or we want to look back at historical controversies as they develop. The other element is that Hrushevsky believed that modern history studied what we largely would call an ethnos. That is, a cultural group which could be identified by outer characteristics which he and his generation believed were the component parts of at least the European continent and beyond. That is, that there were people who largely by language, but not only defined by folk customs, background, some degrees identity, that these groups were the natural components of a society and history, that they were worthy of study, and that above all, that in the long term, that a national and an ethnic factor, an ethne, existed from the Middle Ages, at least in Europe, and down into his time. Now, this is a view that is much disputed in much of the historiography we have had of the past 40 or 50 years, both the national history and the history of the ethnos or ethnic group has been placed in question, in many ways I think quite properly so. But there have always been those who have then said, but wait a second, let's go back at the sources and say, do the Armenians exist in the 4th or 5th century, or do they not? And if the sources tell us there were Armenians, and what are they then? What are these groups of the past that are identified? And as well, Professor Armstrong, who I mentioned, wrote a book about nations before nationalism, very well known now as Anthony Smith, who tells us to look at ethne now as groups. And as such, it is possible to study them. The question is this the only thing that should be studied? And should their relationship to political structures and whatever we define as nations, how they relate? But certainly this is what Hrushevsky believed. Other later historians, and I think he as well, also saw the need to study higher structures of society. He in practice studied political structures, higher social structures, and believed that there was a development of these ethno and national groups. In many ways, he advocated the idea that twice Ukrainians, as an ethnos, had lost their elites. Once in the 16th century, largely to the Poles, and once at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, to the Russians. You can find very similar discussions, by the way, by Ivan Lysyak-Rudnitsky, a great professor of this university, and in his discussions, for those of you who took courses. And then finally, he believed that history should be the history of the people in the sense of the common people. This largely in the end of the 19th century meant the peasantry, because we remember that all Central European societies and Eastern European societies were overwhelmingly peasant still in their composition. And following much of the thinking of German and other thinkers, he believed that these folk cultures, cultures outside of urban centers, were worthy of development, were worthy of study, and that these languages, the languages, above all the vernacular, should become the major language, not what would be called foreign, alien, or lingua franca, accepted scholarly languages, that each people developing its language would develop itself. But with this came, in many ways, social history. That is, he believed you studied cultural history, social history, and tried to reach those groups which were very hard to study, and had been left out of the great histories who studied great men, political entities, and state structures. And he's arguing for a different kind of history. Now, what did this mean for his development of the history? When he studied the first volumes, he takes you back to what he sees as the tribal groups, hard to discover their tribes, from which he sees the ethnos of Ukrainians emerging. He takes that to the formation of the Rus state, and he tries to tell us about the society and culture of Rus and takes it down to the 14th century. And those are the first 3 volumes. And those volumes, largely, were a challenge to Russian historians. They said that the history that followed the history of the dynasties who had ruled these Slavs and took them to Moscow and Petersburg, or studied empires, were not the way to study history, that societies were continuous, that you had to study all the groups of societies, and that the ethnos that forms in the Ukrainian territories develops over time, has an ongoing tradition, and it is related to the old Rus state. So those 3 volumes, in many ways, put a claim for that. The 3 central volumes deal with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which comes into the Ukrainian territories, and the Kingdom of Poland, and deals with that period down to the 16th century. But what he's really aiming, and in this sense, he sees these Hegelian cycles, he is aiming towards getting to a rebirth that occurs in the late 16th century, led by the Cossacks, the church revolt, what he sees as the great revolts of the 17th century, led by the Cossacks, which is mass uprisings, and he believes is a regeneration of a Ukrainian entity. So the Polish-Lithuanian volumes are sort of this intermediary period between the old Rus and the Cossack Ukraine. This I find is interesting when you think of the Ukrainian movement and how it develops. I think a book that I much recommend, although I've been harsh in my review of it, is Timothy Snyder's Reconstructing Nations. Timothy Snyder is probably known to you for his work on the Holocaust, on the Holodomor, on the 20th century problems. But he wrote a very interesting work which tries to discuss the evolution of national communities in East Central Europe, largely based on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and argues that there was an early modern nation, a civic nation, largely of the nobility of the Polish-Lithuanian state, that really went all the way down, in the Ukrainian case, till 1914. It's quite a stretch on this. And then that this kind of civic, social structure, national community, is destroyed by the new concepts of ethno-national communities that historians espouse, and develop into what are the modern Lithuanians, Belarusians, Poles, and Ukrainians. So they break down this old structure. And in so doing, what he argues is that what happens is the new national communities emphasize their medieval past, and not this early modern period he sees from 1569 to the beginning of the I would say I'll give him to the beginning of the 19th century, but he even longer. It doesn't fit Ukrainians because the Ukrainian movement that develops in really out of the historical thought of Central and Eastern Ukraine, it develops in doing so on the basis largely of the study of the Cossacks, and that's the core of the Ukrainian movement that Hrushevsky brings largely to Lviv in 1890. That is, Ukrainians in their initial phase of nation forming, modern nation forming, concentrated exactly on the early modern, but not Snyder's early modern of the Polish-Lithuania, but of what they saw as the Cossack counter. And that Galicia until then had largely been the only place, and I think Andriy Zaranyuk, a book we put out in our institute, has argued this very interestingly, did study the old Rus, Galicia-Volhynia as their state. But then Hrushevsky then redirects them initially to the Kievan-Rus period. He changes that. So in fact, the Ukrainian movement starting on the early modern, then does the medieval. Excuse me. So this is, I think, one of the interesting parts of what he gives as a paradigm of history. When he comes to do the Polish-Lithuanian period, he is quite positive towards Lithuania. Lithuania adopts the Ruthenian, that is the common Belarusian-Ukrainian language, much of its culture. In the early period, many of the Lithuanian princes convert to Orthodoxy, generally positive on it. But Hrushevsky is extremely critical of the Polish state. And what he's doing is answering a concept of Polish mission that argued there was a Polish civilizing mission in the East, and that there should be, as late as 1900, an attempt to resurrect the old Polish-Lithuanian state, perhaps as a federal state, something often called the Jagiellonian idea. And these ideas, not held by all Polish historians, were extremely important for them. And Hrushevsky is saying no. And what he is doing is in two ways. One, he is rejecting the social base of much Polish historical writing as glorifying the noble state that he sees as really a failed form of statehood, one that leads to the decay. And remember, Poland goes through a long decay, the old Polish-Lithuanian state, for 100 years before it gets to partition. He argues it's on social grounds, it was a poor model, not the one that should be followed. And so on that term, he believes it. And then secondly, he views that territory, and it's particularly important in Galicia, where the old name, even in Polish, of this territory was Rus. It was the Ruska Vojevodstva. It was the Ruthenian territory. He argues, this is our land. Build Poland on your land. Now, where is our land and your land is always very difficult to determine. And of course, Poles had many arguments as to why they had, for centuries, been part of much of the Ukrainian territory. So that's, I think, an important case. That linked to the broader population. And I see I'm exhausting my time, so I'm not going to read another quote. You can see how I put Father, many of you know I published these works of Father Mykhailo Hrushevsky, a clergyman, ethnographer in Galicia, and the second volume of those works are out there. But I had a quote in which Father Hrushevsky, when he is writing a piece on what he sees as the misrule of the Polish nobility of 1900, quotes Hrushevsky to say, we had a vibrant Rus old culture that lasted up until the 13th and 14th century, that was directly in contact with world cultures. And our contact with Poland deprived us of this contact. Now, why I was going to use that quote, and it's in volume 3 of Hrushevsky, for those of you who run out and buy that volume, it concludes it, so I much recommend this passage. I recommend it because what it shows is how Hrushevsky's voice was now reaching a large part of the population, not necessarily by reading his volumes, but by the use of his volumes by the rest of the intelligentsia who are writing about this. And he was answering the need of a society which needed to feel itself to have its own tradition, to countervail a vision that all that was higher culture had to be Polish, argued and connected them with a certain Rus tradition that was quite different. And in that case, I think is relatively valuable. But also, it put them on this side of what might be called, they viewed as progressive. That is, it challenged what they see as the backward social relations and political relations of 1900, which is now associated in their mind with Polish. Ukrainian is associated with another issue. Then I promised in my initial announcement to say something about some contemporary issues. So I will pass on from that to this before I'll open up for some questions, and then we will do the launch part of it. So what I would say is we are going through a period of renewed Polish-Ukrainian tension. But I think unexpected by many people. Would assume that the rather good relations between Poland and Ukraine that developed in the early 1990s were going to be a long-term and one way that history moves forward. Now, part of those there are many reasons why Polish-Ukrainian relations developed quite positively in the 1990s, but not the least of it was new concepts of historical thought. I would argue, particularly starting in the 1960s and led by people like Professor Zbigniew Wójcik, many of the Polish myths on Ukraine were challenged in Poland. Poland had a rather free historical profession in the 60s, 70s in many ways. Not entirely free. You still couldn't publish a history of Ukraine without censorship, but you could say things about Ukraine. And what they began to do was challenge some of the axiomatic, say, visions of Henryk Sienkiewicz as his vision of the East, which are the popular visions of with fire and sword that many Poles were brought up. And that historical profession in Poland, in many ways, laid the groundwork for, at least in that world, and I don't want to overestimate historians, of rethinking how they dealt with Ukraine. And although the 20th century was little dealt with, they at least could get to the First World War, and maybe at times to interwar Poland to rethink things. Not easy in interwar Poland, as you know, because they were under the red censorship. And in the same way, in the late 80s and early 90s, we had new and challenging thought in Ukrainian historiography. The two-volume history of Ukraine that's put out by Natalia Yakovenko and Yaroslav Hrycak question what might be called many of the national paradigms of the Ukrainian past. Natalia Yakovenko, the paradigms held by great scholars like Yaroslav Isayevich or Yaroslav Dashkevich, but already Yakovenko thinks in new ways and is even willing to, in many ways, some might argue, to positively glorify the old Polish state, but certainly to demystify some of the Ukrainian visions, to explain why Ukrainian elites adopted things from Poland, to see positive aspects that Hrushevsky would not have seen. And Yaroslav Hrycak even more so for the 19th and early 20th century. And all that was very positive, I think, in these developments. But history never moves in one way. And there are always reactions and there are always new conditions. And some of these have now reemerged in quite remarkable ways. At the moment, the attempt by some Polish historians to see Polish nationhood as somehow a civic nation already in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and Ukrainians as proponents of ethno-nationalism that's negative, is, I think, specious in many ways, both in describing the old Polish state and how it adopted, and in some ways the Ukrainian movement as it is in this time. On the other hand, we clearly see a return to nation in some elements of Ukrainian historiography, largely dealing with 20th century problems, but these are getting projected back into the past. So suddenly the debates we thought were over come back again. So a book which has raised much controversy is a book by a Polish scholar, Łukasz Adamski, called Nacjonalisty postępowi, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, jego poglądy na Polską i Polaków. So this is a progressive nationalist, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, and his views on Poland and Poles. Nationalist in Polish can only be a negative term, very generally. So this is the difficulty. How can you have a progressive nationalist? It doesn't make sense. Caused much debate. And last year, I, for the Hrushevsky anniversary, went to the city that Ukrainians call Cholm and Poles call Helm, the city of Danilo of Halich that is formed, where an international conference was to be held on Hrushevsky. And suddenly, the issue of whether you could have a monument to Hrushevsky in his birthplace city is now in question again. I was invited to debates in a debate in the Polish theater in Warsaw on Hrushevsky. And first I was a little puzzled about what were we going to debate. It was, by the way, a wonderful discussion that goes on. But suddenly, these elements come back into the past, and Hrushevsky becomes part of this discussion. I took part in College of Europe, a discussion on anarchy, freedom in the past, going all the way back to the Polish-Lithuanian state, but up to current affairs, in which I posed that certain visions of the liberty of the Polish-Lithuanian state of the 16th, 17th century were not held by Ukrainian historians of the 18th century Hetmanate, and a leader of now the new Polish right got up and said that I was trying to deprive Poles of the right to glorify their old state. And I said, no, keep glorifying it as you choose, just that this is not my glorification. All of these I found very interesting. And in a certain way, national history, which seemed to be waning, is coming back. Now, some of it's very badly done, but some of it is an antidote to what I would argue to excessive tendencies to view the nation as entirely a construct, having no basis and deeper bases, and not being connected with earlier periods. With this, we see in this time formations of new ideas in which Hrushevsky plays a major role yet in Ukrainian historical consciousness, either by those who reject some of his views or those who adopt him. But basically what I would argue is, both as a historian and a politician, Hrushevsky conceptualized the Ukrainian ethnos into a nation, took part in the formation of the Ukrainian state by which borders were created. The Ukraine, not quite the ones he would have wanted on that map, comes about. And so that even you can have a discussion now about the relation of, and here I think the civic and ethnic nation is going to be very interesting. Now when we have, at least I assume, except the occupied territories, 90% of the Ukrainian population of Ukraine now declaring themselves being Ukrainian by nationality, perhaps the two are coming together. But certainly the relationship between that ethno-cultural nation and Ukraine would not exist today with any borders were there not first a conceptualization of an ethno-cultural nation. And that Hrushevsky played a major role. Okay, with that I finish my too long presentation and open up, I guess, for 10 minutes of question before we do our launch, for those who would like to question, challenge, or denounce. That's next. That's next. We'll come. Yes.
You talked about the current increase in tensions between Ukrainians and Poles. To what extent is that as a result of a Russian campaign to drive tensions between Ukrainians?
Yeah. Would I know that? Well, yes, partially, not, but I think I would not overemphasize that. These are still many areas to be discussed, to be debated, and they are not done in one time. So I would not always look for another hand. Yes, of course, we know now that the hand of the FSB and their money goes everywhere. But okay, to give an example where I could see, you don't solve things in a day. The cemetery issue in Lviv, which was a issue which everyone hoped would be solved easily. But really, now as we're coming to 1918, right, or I'm coming to 1918, that means 2018, we're going to discuss this all over again, right? We are going to come to the points of the 1st of November, 1918, right, Listopadovi Chin, now reemerges as a discussion. And you can't assume that there's not going to be a new generation that is going to want to newly discuss and debate these issues. in what is today Poland, which has become more concentrated on national issues. And I think those things are natural. So yes, I think in some ways there could be a Russian hand. I mean, we hear about all these things in Polish ministries of defense, and we know that Ukraine is infiltrated by, but let's not underestimate that these are historical issues, and they are not easy issues, and they have to be debated, and it is difficult at times to see. I think one thing you can see is in historians who were relatively open on Polish-Ukrainian affairs 10 and 15 years ago, on both sides, a tightening at the moment. And I don't think that's being done by Russian money or agents or things. Yes, please.
How many percent already translated and what left?
What?
Supposed to be translated?
Oh, okay, yeah, and we will get, okay. So, and I may move then just on those. So there are 10 now translated, 2 to go. So the 10 of them are out there, and this is slightly different from Hrushevsky, who has 11 books in 10 volumes. We had to break up 9 into one extra one, and we did on that. Okay, then I'll perhaps move on to lunch if people want to get onto this. Yes, Roman. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, if you would like.
Would you comment on Hrushevsky's political views, socialist as I understand it, with the Western Ukrainian socialism, the Franco movement and so on? Is there a substantial difference, or were Central Ukrainian socialism of the day and Western Ukrainian socialism more or less the same in substance?
Yeah, I would not call Hrushevsky a socialist. So that's the first. Franco is, of course, changes over time. Hrushevsky, in his vision of society, was willing to adapt sometimes radical social when he's in Galicia, sometimes not. He breaks with the conservatives in Galicia. He breaks with the clerical conservatives who are the core of the group that bring him there, right? They're the group that bring him in. And in that sense, has a different view. And of course, he views Galician society as terribly turgid, unwilling to adopt more revolutionary views. That's why the students follow him, right? But without a definite message, because he has this national message and socially progressive message, and certainly not Marxist vision. There are Marxists in Galicia already and Marxist parties. They don't quite fit with him as well. So his predilection initially is towards the radicals, but then he moves away from them because of the national issue as time goes on in Galicia and Galician society. Okay. And then I think I'll move on, having been too long, on to launch proper. Okay, volume, the volume that we are presenting today. Okay, and each of this volume deals with the political life of Poland and Lithuania from the 14th century to 1569. It is the beginning of a cycle in which volume 6 is out there, which we have 5 has to come out yet. He then follows it by 2 volumes that discuss cultural issues, church issues, social issues, structures of the peasantry. But this is above all a description of the political life and affairs that occurs with the fall of the Galician-Volhynian state up until the Union of Lublin of 1569. All right. This cover on this is the castle of Lubartas in Lutsk, a sign of the Lithuanian rule of the 14th century that comes into the Ukrainian territories. It is a volume that deals with, in many ways, the elites of society and the way in which Ukrainian lands are absorbed, and the relationship between Poland and Lithuania of this period. It deals with a lot of discussions of the various agreements, beginning in the Union of Krevel. This is 1385. These are extremely important, and down to that Union of Lublin of 1569 that forms a federated Polish-Lithuanian state. And he wants to put Ukraine into these. Among other things, it argues that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania really belongs much more properly to Lithuanian and Belarusian history, that Ukraine is not central to these territories. The way that Hrushevsky then tackled this problem was really quite new, because there was not a major research going on among most Ukrainian historians of this time, and there later was not terribly much as well onto these periods. We are very pleased with this volume because it was mentioned by Yars Balan that we try and as well give new approaches, new ideas, and new literature on these periods. So each of these volumes has one or more specialist editors. In this case, our specialist editors were Robert Frost, of the University of Aberdeen, and Yaroslav Fedoruk, who has been an editor of many of our volumes. Robert Frost wrote a long introduction to this volume. There's a second introduction by Svitlana Pankova, who is the director of the Hrushevsky Museum in Kyiv. When you get to Kyiv, you must go to this museum. It's quite a phenomenal museum. It's the original villa of the Hrushevskys before they built the large building that was bombed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. They have been able to gather a considerable amount of Hrushevsky's furniture and artifacts, or at least remarkable given the situation of what happened with all of this. And Svitlana Pankova is a brilliant museum director. I was just in Kyiv when on Hrushevsky's birthday. They ran a skit in which she played Tekla, the maid of the Hrushevskys, and recounted the life of the family, and it was just a superb performance that went on at the Hrushevsky Museum. She then studies Hrushevsky manuscripts and does a very nice introduction. Why I like this is, in some ways, Robert Frost comes from a Polish perspective and Svitlana Pankova from a Ukrainian perspective. So we're able to balance out on various ways, and sometimes they are saying different things in the two introductions, which I think is also useful. And sometimes they are both saying things that don't agree with Hrushevsky. So we want this still to bring this to discussion and bring Hrushevsky to a wider discussion. In each of these volumes, there is, of course, a translator, and in one case, two translators. The translator for this volume was Andriy Vinnytsky from Toronto. We also include additional material on books that have come out since this time. So Olena Rusina, a major specialist in Ukraine on the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, has written bibliographies to this, and Leonty Wojtowicz, a specialist on Galicia, Volhynia, has written a bibliographic note. You get a full bibliography of the work of Hrushevsky that Hrushevsky cites, and this is very important. The original volumes did not have consistent bibliographies. So you get, there's at least, and we do it with Roman numerals, so I will go off on this yet, but there are almost 100 pages, 90-some pages of introductions, explanatory materials, glossaries that explain terms. Then you get Hrushevsky's text, as well as you've got maps on this as well. We have numerous consultants on each of these volumes. I won't read all the list. I ask you to go look at them, but there are, for each of these, at least 10 or 12 scholars. You will find Professor Rowell, great specialist on Lithuania, corrected our Lithuanian names. We get translators from Latin and various other languages, and this is why these volumes are really quite difficult to put out. The only way we are able to produce these volumes is CIUS has had the good fortune to have wonderful editors over many years. And all of those who've read the publications that have come out from the Institute over many years, journals we have put out, but above all the Hrushevsky volumes, which have been remarkably complex, there's no way we would have been able to do this project had it not been for Ulyana Pasichnik, who was managing editor for many years in Toronto, worked on many of the volumes, just as retired this year, and Miroslav Yurkevich, who is with us today, who is the editor for this volume. And I would like to say that they were not only language editors, but they were dedicated to making sure the accuracy of this project. They held us to high standards, and without their careful work, it would be difficult to think of Hrushevsky approaching a wider public in such a readable form. I'd like to ask Miroslav to say a few words about the project, and particularly about our specialist editor, Yaroslav Fedoruk. Miroslav.
Thank you, Frank. This will be brief, I promise. As the Romans famously said, books have their fate. And it was indeed fateful that work on this translation began in the year that Ukraine declared its independence, 1991. Fateful in two ways. On the one hand, the fact that Ukraine became an independent state, as we see from the perspective of a quarter century successfully, made the publication of this series politically unnecessary. You don't have to prove your national distinction by literature when you do it politically. On the other hand, had we not had the work begun before 1991, we would not have had the crucial assistance of scholars, many scholars working in Ukraine, who, without whom this seemingly endless project would have become truly interminable. Frank already mentioned Svetlana Pankova and Olena Rusina and their contributions. I should also mention Miron Kapral and Andriy Hrechilo of Lviv, who compiled the bibliographies. Rostislav Paranko, a Latinist at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, who translated the many Latin quotations into English. And I'd like to say a few more words about Dr. Yaroslav Fedoruk, a senior scholar at the Hrushevsky Institute of Archaeography and Source Studies in Kyiv, who has perhaps made the single most important contribution to this translation. He has been to Edmonton 4 times, coming in for months at a time to work on reading the text, establishing the fidelity of the translation to the original, checking and correcting bibliographic references. This is quite challenging because all of Hrushevsky's bibliographic references are in his notes. He has no bibliography in his Ukrainian originals. And it's often no easy task to determine precisely which source Hrushevsky is cited. So, this is a difficult enterprise that Yaroslav was engaged in. He's a specialist in 17th century international relations and has published many studies of Bogdan Khmelnytsky's foreign policy, including a major work on the Treaty of Vilnius of 1656. He's also the editor of the Ukrainian Archaeographic Annual, a volume of scholarly articles on historical subjects that appears every year. Yaroslav wrote, first of all, he worked on 4 of the volumes. And he wrote introductions to volumes 922 and 10. In the first, he analyzed Cossack foreign policy and in the last years of Bogdan Khmelnytsky's life. In the second, he wrote what is surely the best research account to date of Hrushevsky's last years, which were spent in exile in Moscow, and where he finished the first half of volume 10, a volume that was never completed. In 2015, Yaroslav served with the Ukrainian forces in the current war with Russia. He was wounded. Fortunately, it was a light wound, and he made a complete recovery. And last year, he obtained a fellowship to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where he studied Harvard's extensive collection of 17th century English newspapers to find out how they reported the news from Ukraine during and after the Khmelnytsky uprising. That will be the subject of his next publications. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good. And then one more person as this cross between Ukraine and Canada should be mentioned, that's Serhiy Plokhy. Not for this volume, but for many, as associate director of the center, and as someone who worked on many of the volumes and published, of course, a magnificent monograph on Hrushevsky. And of course, had he not arrived from Ukraine at a crucial moment, all of our studies would not have been as rich. And we owe him a lot, a debt of gratitude to it. Now, the volumes come out, of course, because people believe that they should come out and help to make them come out. So the devotee of this project was the late Dr. Peter Jacek. Mr. Peter Jacek, well known to all of us as a philanthropist, who wanted to see Hrushevsky out in English. And this was one of the mandates of the formation of the center. And certainly, without the support of the Jacek Foundation, it would have been impossible to undertake this project. We have frequently turned to other sources for donation. The Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies has supported this project, and we particularly were fortunate that a group in England, the trustees of the Edward Brodatsky estate, gave us very major funding for keeping our project going. I think it's not a secret to anyone dealing with academia that when the drop of stock markets and endowments happened in 2008, 2009, particularly something like the Jacek Center, dependent on an endowment fund, was in not good shape. And so without this kind of support, we would have been unable to keep going. Each volume has had a sponsor, either an individual or an organization. It was mentioned that Dr. Jeanette Bajduja was a sponsor for volume 6. We are very fortunate that the sponsor for this volume was the Ukrainian-Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko. And I'd like to ask Andriy Hladishevsky to come up so I can present him with a volume and he can tell us a bit about the foundation and its role in this.
I'm going to ask one of my co-directors, Gordon Gorday, also to come up.
Okay, good. Sure.
Great, present it to him and I'll just
Okay.
Okay.
Take it to the beach in the summer.
again.
This is lighter than volume 8, so that at least it's a little better to have it. Okay, sure. Thank you very much.
Well, I have 178 seconds allocated, personally allocated, that I limited myself to, so I will be even briefer. Again, імені ради директорів Українсько-канадської фундації Тараса Шевченка дякую за присутність і вечір. Щиро всі вам дякую за підтримку для цей величезний проєкт. I want to thank everybody in the room. There are some, maybe about 50 of us that are here, but I'm here on behalf of several thousand donors to the Ukrainian-Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko. There'd be a few hundred of them in Alberta, and as one of the lead volunteers, myself and Gordon here represent those donors who put together the $100,000 that was sort of scurried away from other community projects to this. And as you know, the foundation has sort of 4 pillars in what it funds. It funds arts in its many forms. You'd all be familiar with that. It funds heritage programming, which really deals with the preservation of historical materials and in some cases folkloric materials. It has a large community development pillar. Things like the Blue West Festival would be a major beneficiary of that and other festivals, but it also has a large education component within it that allows us to give scholarships, allow Ukrainian-Canadian students now to basically travel to Ukraine and come back. So I'm here to give a plug for the Shevchenko Foundation. I would probably say that if you had a phone and you were actually literate with a phone, you could probably hit a button that has the Shevchenko Foundation chauffeur on it, and you will get this wonderful, wonderful, it tells you how to donate, tells you what the tax effect of that donation is, tells you where your money goes. And, you know, to be 99% of the people in this room are part of the Ukrainian-Canadian community. In my view, you're not a fully fledged member of that community unless you donated to the foundation. The thousands of people that have are passionate that there is a Ukrainian-Canadian community in this room, but there's one out there, a big one, from coast to coast to coast. And the people that are our grantees are deserving of that support. Every dollar I've ever put into the foundation has been fully supported by my wife and family, who think it's a great investment in leaving a legacy for future generations. And in these times, over the past 10 years, I get lots of calls about endowments in universities or family foundations where people are skeptical of the use of that money. Usually they get skeptical when you get into the second and third generation of money, particularly in family foundations, where the progeny of the progeny no longer have the vision of the people that started that. Well, this is the third generation of the Shevchenko Foundation, and it remains totally accountable to the Ukrainian-Canadian community. It remains totally passionate about the Ukrainian-Canadian community, and it looks forward to 6 generations and more of its contribution. And so this is one of those contributions that I accept. This will be a duplicate of the one I will have on my shelf with everything else. But I want to thank the Hrushevsky project and the scholars for contractually fulfilling their obligations to the foundation in our contribution agreement, and for allowing me to have just a few seconds with you.